The morning sun peeked through the elegant curtains of the Rose Valley Vineyards bridal suite, casting a warm glow on the soon-to-be bride's face. Mrs. Chen couldn't help but smile as she looked at herself in the mirror, hardly believing this day had finally arrived. After 6 years of raising her daughter alone, working double shifts at the hospital as a nurse, and nearly giving up on love, here she was, about to marry the man she thought was perfect. Her teenage daughter, Annie, busied herself arranging the wedding dress on the antique couch nearby. The ivory fabric sparkled under the chandelier, making Annie pause every few seconds to admire the delicate beadwork her mom had chosen. She watched her mother through the mirror's reflection, noticing how much younger she looked today, glowing with happiness. "Mom, you won't believe what Aunt Jenny did," Annie chuckled, trying to lighten the nervous energy in the room. "She's already crying, and it's only 9 a.m. She used up all her tissues and had to borrow some from the kitchen staff." The mother-daughter duo burst into laughter, their voices echoing off the suite's high ceilings. The bridal suite was a buzz of activity. Mrs. Chen's best friend since college, Lisa, waltzed in carrying a tray of fresh croissants and mimosas. "No bride of mine is getting married on an empty stomach," she announced, setting down the tray on the vintage vanity. The smell of warm butter and orange juice filled the air, mixing with the sweet scent of roses arranged throughout the room. As Mrs. Chen sipped her mimosa, she watched her loved ones through the mirror. Her sister was attempting to teach Annie how to properly bustle the wedding dress, while her mother arranged the veil with trembling hands. 4 generations of strong women, together in one room, preparing for what should be the happiest day of her life. "Remember when you first told me about Mr. Rodriguez?" Annie asked, carefully placing pearl pins in her mother's elegantly styled hair. "You came home from that coffee shop looking like a teenager with a crush." She gently tucked a loose strand behind her mom's ear, their eyes meeting in the mirror. Mrs. Chen blushed, remembering that rainy afternoon 2 years ago. She had ducked into the local coffee shop to escape a sudden downpour, only to literally bump into the charming real estate developer who would become her fiancé. He had helped her clean up the spilled coffee, insisted on buying her a new one, and they ended up talking for hours. It felt like fate then, now it felt like a perfect dream coming true. The makeup artist arrived, setting up her tools while sharing stories about other weddings she had worked. The room filled with the gentle buzz of the hairdryer, occasional laughter, and the soft clinking of champagne glasses. Outside, wedding staff could be heard setting up chairs on the lawn, their muffled voices carrying through the window. Annie stepped back to answer a text from her best friend, who would be arriving soon to help with the preparations. She watched her mother close her eyes as the makeup artist began working, noticing how peaceful she looked. After everything they'd been through together, the late nights, the tough times, the tears and triumphs, Annie felt her heart swell with joy seeing her mom so happy. But there was something else too, a tiny nagging feeling she couldn't quite place. Maybe it was just normal wedding day jitters, or maybe it was the way Mr. Rodriguez had acted strange at the rehearsal dinner last night. Annie pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the excitement of the day ahead. The morning continued to unfold like a carefully choreographed dance. More relatives arrived, bearing small gifts and big hugs. Stories flowed as freely as the champagne, with aunts sharing marriage advice and cousins taking countless photos. The room grew warmer with love and laughter, creating the kind of moment that would be remembered forever in family stories. As the clock moved closer to noon, Mrs. Chen stood to step into her wedding dress. The room fell silent, all eyes on the bride as Annie and Lisa helped her with the delicate buttons. The dress fit perfectly, transforming Mrs. Chen into something out of a fairy tale. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as mother and daughter caught each other's reflection in the mirror, both trying not to cry and ruin their makeup. Little did they know that this perfect morning was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would test their bond and change their lives forever. But for now, in this peaceful moment, everything was exactly as it should be, beautiful, hopeful, and full of promise. Annie hurried down the vineyard's polished hallway, her bridesmaid dress swishing softly against the wooden floors. Her mom had forgotten her favorite perfume, the one that used to belong to Annie's grandmother, and Mr. Rodriguez had offered to keep it safe in his room. "Just grab it from my jacket pocket," he'd said with his usual charming smile. "The gray suit hanging in the closet." The groom's suite was quieter than the bustling bridal room, with morning sunlight streaming through tall windows. Annie found the grey suit easily enough, but as she reached into the pocket, her fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. Puzzled, she pulled out not just the perfume bottle, but also a sleek black phone she'd never seen before. "That's weird," she muttered to herself. Mr. Rodriguez always carried his brown leather-cased phone, the one he'd shown off at family dinners, filled with photos of him and her mom. Annie turned the black phone over in her hands, noticing it had no case, no personal touches. Just then, it buzzed with an incoming message. Her heart started beating faster. She knew she shouldn't look. This was probably just a work phone, something completely innocent. But why hadn't he ever mentioned it? The message preview caught her eye before she could look away. "When are you going to finish up with this one? Time's running out." With trembling fingers, Annie found the phone and unlocked. Her stomach dropped as she scrolled through message after message, each one worse than the last. There were conversations with someone saved as partner discussing targets and payouts. Photos of other women, all similar to her mom's age, all seemingly wealthy, with notes about their potential. "No, no, no," Annie whispered, her free hand covering her mouth. There was a folder labeled Current Project with detailed notes about her mother. Everything was there. Her mom's work schedule, bank information, properties, and even Annie's school details. The last entry made her blood run cold. "Wedding day equals access to all assets. Final stage complete." The perfume bottle slipped from her hand, landing softly on the plushed carpet. Annie's mind raced through every interaction with Mr. Rodriguez over the past 2 years. The expensive gifts that seemed so generous. The way he'd encouraged her mom to invest in his exclusive real estate projects. His insistence on a prenuptial agreement that her mom had proudly signed, thinking it proved he wasn't after her money. A sound in the hallway made her jump. Quickly, she snapped photos of the most damaging messages with her own phone, then placed the black phone exactly where she'd found it. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the perfume bottle again as she picked it up. Back in the hallway, Annie leaned against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. Through a nearby window, she could see the wedding set up on the lawn, white chairs in neat rows, flowers everywhere, the arch where her mom was supposed to say, "I do," in just a few hours. Everything looked so perfect from the outside. "Hey, sweetie, did you find it?" Her aunt's voice made her jump. "Your mom's asking for you. The photographer wants to start the pre-ceremony shots." Annie plastered on a smile, clutching the perfume bottle. "Yeah, got it. Just needed a minute to, fix my shoe." She followed her aunt back toward the bridal suite, her mind spinning. How could she tell her mom? When should she tell her? Should she tell her at all? Through the suite's door, she could hear her mom laughing at something Lisa had said. That happy, carefree laugh she'd started doing again only after meeting Mr. Rodriguez. Annie thought about all the nights her mom had worked extra shifts at the hospital, saving every penny to give them a good life. All the times they'd sat at their kitchen table, budgeting together, dreaming about their future. The weight of what she'd discovered pressed down on Annie's chest like a heavy stone. If she stayed quiet, her mom would marry a con man who planned to steal everything they'd worked for. But if she spoke up now, she'd break her mom's heart on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Annie checked her phone again, looking at the evidence she'd photographed. The messages were clear. Mr. Rodriguez had done this before. There were references to other women, other weddings, other lives he'd destroyed. Her mom wasn't the first, but Annie was determined she would be the last. Taking a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and reached for the door handle. The photographer could wait. First, she needed to find a quiet moment to talk to her mom. The thought of what she had to do made her feel sick, but she kept thinking of all those nights her mom had protected her from everything bad in the world. Now it was her turn to protect her mom. As she opened the door, the sounds of joy and celebration washed over her. Her mom looked up, smiling brightly, completely unaware that her whole world was about to change. Annie clutched the perfume bottle tighter, knowing that sometimes the greatest act of love is telling a painful truth. The next hour felt like the longest of Annie's life. She sat in the corner of the bridal suite, watching as the photographer directed everyone into various poses. Her mom stood in the center of it all, radiant in her wedding dress, while bridesmaids and family members orbited around her like stars around the sun. "Annie, honey, come join us," her mom called out, gesturing to the empty space beside her. "We need one of just us two." Annie forced herself to move, to smile, to pretend everything was normal. As she stood next to her mom, she could smell that familiar perfume, the one that had led to her devastating discovery. The photographer adjusted their positions, telling them to move closer. "Perfect. Now, Mom, tell your daughter something that'll make her laugh naturally." Annie felt her mom's arm squeeze around her shoulders as she leaned in to whisper, "Remember when you were 5 and insisted on wearing your superhero cape to my hospital graduation?" Despite everything, Annie couldn't help but laugh. The memory was so clear. Her refusing to take off the red cape she'd made from an old curtain, declaring she needed to be ready to save anyone who fainted from happiness at seeing her mom become a real nurse. She'd always seen her mom as a superhero. Now, at 16, she felt like she was the one who needed to be brave. Between photos, Annie checked her phone again, looking at the evidence she'd gathered. Each time she saw those messages, her stomach twisted into tighter knots. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder with each passing minute, counting down to the 2 p.m. ceremony. "You okay?" Lisa asked, catching Annie alone by the refreshment table. "You look a little pale." Annie grabbed a glass of water, using the moment to compose herself. "Just nervous about my speech," she lied, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. Lisa patted her arm sympathetically, not knowing that the maid of honor speech was the last thing on Annie's mind. Through the window, she could see the guests starting to arrive. Aunt Jenny was directing people to their seats, her voice carrying faintly through the glass. The string quartet was setting up under the oak tree, their instrument cases gleaming in the afternoon sun. Everything looked so perfect, so normal. How could something so beautiful be built on such an ugly lie? Annie's phone buzzed. A message from her best friend. "Can't wait to see you rock that speech. Your mom's going to cry happy tears." She stared at those words, happy tears, knowing that any tears shed today would be far from happy if she spoke up. But wouldn't they be better than the tears that would come later when Mr. Rodriguez had taken everything? Her thoughts were interrupted by the makeup artist calling her over for a touch-up. As she sat in the chair, she watched her mom in the mirror, surrounded by loving family and friends. Everyone was sharing their marriage advice and well wishes. "The secret is trust," her grandmother was saying, her eyes twinkling. "When you find someone you can trust completely, that's true love." Those words hit Annie like a physical blow. Trust. Her mom trusted Mr. Rodriguez completely. That's why she'd never questioned his late-night business calls, his frequent trips, his insistence on handling all their financial paperwork. She trusted him so much she'd already added his name to her bank accounts to make things easier after the wedding, he'd said. The makeup artist dabbed at Annie's eyes, assuming the tears forming there were from emotion. "Don't worry, sweetie. I'm using waterproof everything today." Annie managed a weak smile, wondering if any makeup could withstand the storm that was coming. A burst of laughter drew her attention to where her mom was opening a gift from her hospital colleagues, a pair of silly just-married scrubs. The joy on her mom's face was pure and complete. She'd waited so long for this day, worked so hard to build a life that could attract someone like Mr. Rodriguez. How cruel that the very success she'd achieved had made her a target. Annie excused herself to the bathroom, needing a moment alone. She splashed cold water on her wrists, a trick her mom had taught her for calming down. In the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She looked older somehow, like the weight of her knowledge had aged her. The clock on her phone showed 1:30 p.m., 30 minutes until the ceremony. Back in the suite, final preparations were underway. Someone was steaming the veil one last time. The bouquets were being distributed, filling the room with the sweet scent of roses and lilies. Her mom was holding her grandmother's handkerchief, something borrowed, something blue, and carefully tucking it into her dress. Annie thought about all the fairy tales she'd read as a kid, how the heroes always faced a moment of truth, a moment when they had to decide between what was easy and what was right. This was her moment. Looking at her mom's happy face, she knew she couldn't let this fairy tale end with, and the con man stole everything they had. Taking a deep breath, Annie squared her shoulders and walked toward her mom. "Can we talk privately for a minute?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just us?" Her mom looked up, surprise flickering across her face at Annie's serious tone. Of course, sweetie. Everything okay? Annie led her mom toward the private sitting area of the suite, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. As she closed the door behind them, she sent up a silent prayer for strength. Sometimes love meant being brave enough to break someone's heart to save them from something worse. This was one of those times. In the private sitting area of the bridal suite, Mrs. Chen settled onto the antique love seat, careful not to wrinkle her wedding dress. The room felt suddenly too small, too quiet. Annie's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her chest. "Mom," she started, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to show you something, and it's going to be really hard to look at." She watched her mother's face shift from concern to confusion. "When I went to get your perfume from Mr. Rodriguez's room, I found something else too." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor as Annie sat beside her mom, unlocking her phone. "I found another phone in his jacket pocket. Not his regular one, a different one. And I know I shouldn't have looked, but Mom, I'm so glad I did." She pulled up the photos she'd taken of the messages, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone. Mrs. Chen's expression changed as she began to scroll through the images. At first, there was disbelief, a slight shake of her head, a confused smile as if waiting for the punchline of a joke. Then came the moment of recognition. Annie watched as her mom's face drained of color, the bouquet in her lap trembling as her hands began to shake. This can't be right," Mrs. Chen whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. She kept scrolling, each swipe of her finger revealing more of the horrible truth. The detailed notes about her finances, the conversations about previous successes, the photos of other women who looked so much like her, successful single mothers who'd thought they'd found true love. Annie reached for her mom's hand. "There's more," she said gently. "He's done this before, multiple times. All those business trips. He was meeting other women, setting up other cons. The real estate projects he wanted you to invest in. They don't exist." The weight of the truth seemed to physically press Mrs. Chen back against the love seat. Her free hand went to her throat, fingering the pearl necklace Mr. Rodriguez had given her for their 1-year anniversary. "The pearls," she said quietly. "He said they were his grandmother's. Were they from another?" She couldn't finish the sentence. Suddenly, memories began flooding back, little things that hadn't made sense, but that she dismissed because she trusted him. The way he'd pushed to move up the wedding date, his insistence on having access to her accounts in case of emergency, the mysterious phone calls he'd taken in the garden, speaking too quietly to be heard. "The prenup," Mrs. Chen said, her voice growing stronger with anger. "He insisted on it, said it proved he wasn't after my money. But it only protected his assets, didn't it? Not mine." She stood up abruptly, pacing the small room. The train of her wedding dress swept behind her like a white wave of fury. Annie watched her mom transform before her eyes. The soft, blushing bride was replaced by the strong woman who had raised her alone, who had worked countless night shifts to put herself through nursing school, who had taught Annie that love meant protecting the people who mattered to you. All those women, Mrs. Chen said, still scrolling through the evidence. All those lives he ruined. And he was going to. She couldn't finish the sentence. Instead, she looked at Annie, really looked at her, with a mixture of pride and pain. "My brave girl, you saved us." A knock at the door made them both jump. 15 minutes until the ceremony. Lisa called through the door. "Everything okay in there?" Mrs. Chen looked at her reflection in the ornate mirror. The woman who looked back was wearing a beautiful wedding dress and a face full of expertly applied makeup. But her eyes were different now, clearer, harder, filled with determination. "We need to call the police," she said firmly. "But first," she turned to Annie, pulling her into a fierce hug. "Thank you. Thank you for being brave enough to tell me. Thank you for protecting our family." Annie hugged her back, careful not to wrinkle the dress out of habit, then realized it didn't matter anymore. Outside, they could hear the string quartet beginning to play the prelude music. Guests would be settling into their seats, programs in hand, unaware that the fairy tale wedding was about to become something very different. "I'll go get Uncle David," Annie offered, referring to her mom's brother who was a police officer. "He'll know exactly what to do." But before she could reach the door, it burst open. Mr. Rodriguez stood in the doorway, his charming smile firmly in place. Then his eyes fell on the phone in Mrs. Chen's hands, and the smile vanished like it had never existed. "Darling," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "what are you doing with that?" The man in the doorway was a stranger. Nothing remained of the charming, loving fiancé they'd thought they knew. As he stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, both women realized this confrontation was going to be even harder than they'd imagined. The temperature in the bridal suite seemed to drop 10 degrees as Mr. Rodriguez closed the door behind him. His normally perfect hair was slightly disheveled, his tie loosened, signs that his carefully maintained facade was cracking. The phone in Mrs. Chen's hands felt like a live wire, dangerous and explosive. "Let me explain," he said, taking a step forward. His voice still held that smooth, practiced charm, but now they could hear the falseness in it. "Business can be complicated sometimes, darling. What you're seeing there isn't what you think." Mrs. Chen straightened her spine, years of dealing with difficult patients in the ER giving her strength. "Really? So these other women, these projects you've been tracking, they're not real. The plans to access my accounts after the wedding, those aren't real either." Annie moved closer to her mom, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "We saw everything. The messages to your partner, the photos, the notes about other women. How many times have you done this?" A flash of anger crossed his face, quickly masked by a concerned expression. "Annie, sweetheart, you're misunderstanding things. Adults have complex business dealings that might seem strange to a teenager. Your mother and I can discuss this privately." He reached for the phone, but Mrs. Chen pulled it away. Just then, a commotion arose in the hallway. A woman's voice, unfamiliar but urgent, was arguing with someone outside. "I need to speak to the bride. Please, it's important." The door burst open again, and a well-dressed woman in her 40s rushed in, stopping short at the scene before her. "Oh no," she breathed, looking from Mrs. Chen in her wedding dress to Mr. Rodriguez. "I'm too late." Her eyes hardened as she faced him. "I saw the wedding announcement in the paper. I couldn't let you do this to another family." Mr. Rodriguez's charm evaporated completely. "Mrs. Baker," he said through gritted teeth, "you're disrupting a private ceremony." But Mrs. Baker stood her ground, opening her purse to pull out a folder. 2 years ago, this man, who called himself Mr. Thompson then, did exactly what he's trying to do now, she announced, her voice shaking with emotion. "He married me, gained access to my accounts, and disappeared with everything I'd saved for my children's college fund." The folder contained newspaper clippings, police reports, and photos, evidence of a pattern stretching back years. Mrs. Chen felt her knees weaken, but she remained standing. All those nights he'd held her, promising to love her forever, he'd been planning to destroy her life. "You really should have minded your own business," Mr. Rodriguez said, his voice now cold and unfamiliar. He moved toward the door, but Annie quickly pressed the emergency text she prepared earlier. Within seconds, heavy footsteps could be heard running down the hall. "The ceremony starts in 10 minutes, he said, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Think carefully about what you're doing. Who will believe you? A jealous ex?" He gestured to Mrs. Baker. "A teenager who doesn't want her mother to be happy." His eyes fixed on Annie, a bride with cold feet. But Mrs. Chen wasn't listening anymore. She was looking at the wedding photo in Mrs. Baker's folder, another sunny day, another beautiful venue, another bride smiling trustingly at the camera. The same man beside her, wearing a different name but the same predatory smile. "My daughter believed me," Mrs. Baker said quietly. "Just like your daughter believed in you." She turned to Mrs. Chen. "I lost everything because I was too embarrassed to tell anyone what happened. But you have a chance to stop him." The wedding coordinator's voice carried through the door. "Places everyone. 5 minutes." The string quartet started playing the processional music, its cheerful notes a stark contrast to the tension in the room. Mr. Rodriguez's face hardened as he realized his carefully laid plans were unraveling. "Everything I did was legal," he sneered. "Signed contracts, willing investments. Go ahead, call the police. You'll just embarrass yourselves." "Legal?" Mrs. Chen's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Was it legal when you forged my signature on those investment documents last week? The ones I found in your briefcase but was too trusting to question." She saw the flicker of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't known she'd seen those papers. Annie watched the man who'd almost become her stepfather transform before her eyes. Gone was the gentle smile, the warm laugh, the caring gestures. In their place stood a cornered predator calculating his escape. The door opened one final time, but now it was Uncle David in his police uniform, accompanied by 2 other officers. They'd been guests at the wedding, but now they were here in an official capacity. Mrs. Baker stepped forward, more confident now. "I'll be pressing charges this time," she said firmly, "and I'm sure these ladies will too." Mr. Rodriguez looked at each face in the room, his options disappearing one by one. The weight of his crimes, carried so lightly for so long, finally seemed to settle on his shoulders. Outside, 200 guests waited for a wedding that would never happen. But in that bridal suite, something more important was taking place: justice. The elegant bridal suite had become a powder keg of tension. Mr. Rodriguez's eyes darted between the officers, the door, and the Danning phone still clutched in Mrs. Chen's hands. The string quartet outside, unaware of the drama unfolding, continued playing their cheerful melodies. "This is all a misunderstanding," he said, his voice taking on an edge of desperation. He stepped toward Mrs. Chen, but Uncle David moved quickly between them. "Everything I did was for us, for our future together." His hands were shaking now, his perfectly tailored suit suddenly seeming too tight around the collar. "Don't." Mrs. Chen's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Don't you dare pretend this was about love." She held up the phone, her wedding dress rustling with the movement. "You tracked my work schedule, my bank accounts, my daughter's school routine. You planned everything." The wedding planner knocked on the door again, her voice rising with concern. "Everyone's seated. We need to start." The sound seemed to trigger something in Mr. Rodriguez. His charming mask cracked completely, revealing the desperate man beneath. "You can't prove anything," he snarled, lunging for the phone. Mrs. Baker screamed as he knocked over a vase of roses, sending water and flowers cascading across the antique carpet. Annie moved quickly, pulling her mom away from his reach. Uncle David and the other officers sprang into action. "Don't touch that phone." Mr. Rodriguez's voice had lost all its smoothness, becoming rough and threatening. "You have no right." He struggled against Uncle David's grip, his carefully styled hair falling into his eyes, making him look wild and dangerous. The commotion drew attention from the hallway. Wedding guests began gathering outside the door, murmuring in confusion. Through the growing crowd came a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit, his face pale with recognition. "Richard?" he called out, using a name they'd never heard before. Mr. Rodriguez froze at the sound. "Richard Thompson, my God, it is you." The man turned to the officers. "I'm a district attorney from upstate. We've been looking for this man for months. He's wanted in 3 counties. The revelation sent ripples through the watching crowd. Aunt Jenny started crying, while Lisa pulled out her phone, already calling to stop the caterers and other vendors. The string quartet finally stopped playing, the sudden silence heavy with tension. Mrs. Baker stepped forward, her voice steady. "His name wasn't Richard when he married me. It was Michael Pierce." She opened her folder again, spreading documents on a nearby table. "Here are the marriage certificates, the bank records, everything." Mr. Rodriguez, or whatever his real name was, seemed to deflate before their eyes. The fight drained from him as he realized how completely his scheme had unraveled. "You don't understand," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. It was all so perfect, every detail planned. Annie watched as the officers began reading him his rights. The man who had almost become her stepfather, who had joined their family game nights and helped her with her math homework, was now being handcuffed in his expensive wedding suit. Mrs. Chen sank into a nearby chair, the weight of what they'd narrowly escaped finally hitting her. She reached for Annie's hand, squeezing it tightly. "I'm so sorry, honey," she whispered. "I should have seen it, should have known." But Annie shook her head fiercely. "He fooled everyone, Mom. He was good at it. That's why he got away with it for so long." She knelt beside her mother's chair, careful of the wedding dress. "But he didn't count on us, on our family." The district attorney was conferring with Uncle David, sharing details about other cases, other victims. Mrs. Baker sat with them, adding her story to the growing list of charges. The wedding planner hovered in the doorway, looking shell-shocked, her clipboard hanging limply at her side. As the officers prepared to lead him away, Mr. Rodriguez made one last attempt. "We can still fix this," he called to Mrs. Chen, trying to summon back his charming smile. But it looked grotesque now, like a mask that didn't quite fit. "Think about all our plans, all our dreams." Mrs. Chen stood, drawing herself up to her full height. In her white dress, surrounded by scattered rose petals and the chaos he had created, she looked like an avenging angel. "Our dreams," she said quietly. "They were real for me, for my daughter. But for you, they were just another con." The guests parted like a wave as the officers led him out. His perfectly polished shoes squeaked slightly on the wooden floor, one final, undignified note in his carefully orchestrated performance. As he passed Annie, she saw something she'd never noticed before: a tan line on his finger where another wedding ring had recently been. Through the window, she could see the wedding arch in the garden, white ribbons fluttering in the breeze. The chairs were still arranged in neat rows, programs placed carefully on each seat. Everything looked perfect from a distance, but up close, like so many things about Mr. Rodriguez, the perfect surface had cracked to reveal the ugly truth beneath. The sunset painted the vineyard in shades of gold and pink, a beautiful ending to a day that had turned out so differently than planned. Mrs. Chen sat in the venue's garden, still wearing her wedding dress, surrounded by her closest family members. The guests had long gone home, their whispered conversations and shocked expressions fading with the daylight. "The venue owner says we don't have to pay for anything," Lisa announced, returning from a conversation with the management. "They've dealt with cancelled weddings before, but never quite like this." She sat down next to Mrs. Chen, wrapping an arm around her friend's shoulders. Annie watched her mum from across the table, noting how she sat straighter now, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The catering staff had kindly left them some food and coffee, and the familiar aroma helped ground them all in the aftermath of the day's events. "You know what's funny?" Mrs. Chen said, breaking a long silence. "I keep thinking about all the night shifts I worked at the hospital, all the times I had to trust my instincts with patience." She smiled sadly. "I can spot a dangerous infection from across a room, but I couldn't see what was right in front of me." Uncle David, still in his police uniform, leaned forward. "That's because you're a good person," he said firmly. "You see the best in people." He took advantage of that. He'd spent the last few hours coordinating with other police departments, uncovering more victims, more aliases, more schemes. Mrs. Baker had stayed too, sharing her story over cups of cooling coffee. "It took me months to tell anyone what happened," she admitted. "The shame, the embarrassment, it keeps you quiet. That's what they count on." She reached across the table to squeeze Mrs. Chen's hand. "But you stopped him. Your daughter stopped him." Annie felt a warm glow of pride, mixed with lingering anxiety. "I kept thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't found that phone," she said quietly. "If I hadn't looked, or if I'd been too scared to tell you." "But you did look, and you did tell me," her mom replied, eyes shining with tears and pride. "You trusted your instincts, just like I taught you. You were braver than I've ever been." The wedding planner approached their table, carrying a box. "We saved these for you," she said kindly, placing it down. Inside were the table cards Annie had hand-painted, each one decorated with tiny flowers and guests' names. Hours of work, now just mementos of what might have been. "We should burn them," Aunt Jenny suggested, always the dramatic one. But Mrs. Chen shook her head, picking up one of the cards. "No," she said thoughtfully. "We'll keep them. To remind us that sometimes the best thing that can happen is not getting what you thought you wanted." As the sky darkened, strings of garden lights flickered on automatically, creating a gentle glow around them. The same lights that should have illuminated the reception now witnessed a different kind of celebration, one of truth, family, and narrow escape. "What happens now?" Annie asked, voicing the question they'd all been avoiding. The police had taken statements from everyone, collected evidence, made arrests. But the practical aftermath still loomed, canceling joint accounts, untangling legal documents, explaining to more distant family and friends. Mrs. Chen stood up, smoothing her wedding dress with steady hands. Now we go home. We order takeout from our favorite place. We put on comfortable clothes and watch bad movies until we fall asleep on the couch." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "And tomorrow we start fresh." Lisa and Mrs. Baker exchanged contact information, promising to stay in touch and help with the legal proceedings. Uncle David assured them he handled the police follow-up, shielding them from as much stress as possible. One by one, their supporters headed home, leaving just mother and daughter. In the parking lot, Mrs. Chen paused before getting into their car. The wedding dress gleamed in the security lights, a reminder of dreams deferred but disaster avoided. "You know what I kept thinking about during all of this?" she asked Annie. "That time your school art project exploded with glitter all over the kitchen." Annie laughed in surprise. "What? Why?" "Because that day you were so upset about the mess, thinking you'd ruined everything. But we cleaned it up together, and somehow we kept finding little bits of glitter for months afterward. Every time we found one, it made us laugh." She smiled at her daughter. "Life's like that sometimes. Things fall apart, make a mess. But if you have the right people helping you clean it up, even the mess can bring unexpected joy." They drove home in comfortable silence, the wedding dress filling the back seat like a deflated balloon. As they pulled into their driveway, their small house never looked more welcoming. The porch light was on. They'd left it on that morning, expecting to come home to a changed life. And they had, just not in the way they'd planned. "Mom," Annie said as they reached the front door, "I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but you're still the bravest person I know. And someday, when the right person comes along, they'll see that too." Mrs. Chen pulled her daughter into a tight hug, not caring that they were wrinkling the expensive dress. Above them, stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, reminding them that even the longest days eventually end, making way for new beginnings.